Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 7th of September 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host this afternoon, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to be joined by David Scott, reporting north of the border with northern exposure. Well, Idlib gets ever closer, Mike.
Absolutely. So France 24 here, their headline is Russian airstrikes pound Syria's Idlib before key summit. And what are they saying? Well, they're citing a monitor. Now, I wonder which monitor that could be. Well, of course, it's the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Who else would they cite under these circumstances? Which are saying that 2 people have been killed today so far this morning. Something that amused me, listening to reading the general coverage of this. Lise Doucet, who's the BBC's main foreign correspondent, was reporting on the Today programme on Radio 4 this morning. And while she was decrying the potential for civilian casualties and ignoring the double standards being applied by refusing to acknowledge the cost of the civilian cost of Raqqa and Mosul, as they usually do, she did actually admit and announce that the combatants that are in Idlib are mainly jihadists linked to Al-Qaeda. So she did acknowledge that on the BBC this morning, which I thought was a bit of a step forward perhaps. But according to this France 24 article, apparently a shepherd was also killed and 4 other people wounded. And it's not clear if they were fighters or civilians, though, so things not clear. Now, of course, what's this about? Well, it's because Putin is in Tehran for the summit on what's going to happen to these people in Idlib. I think the Russians have made pretty clear their view that they should be wiped off the face of the earth.
Liquidated,
really. Absolutely.
Was the word used, Mike.
And well, he's also going to meet members of the government of Turkey. And Turkey's in a bit of a difficult position here because, of course, turning its eyes towards Moscow, buying the S-400, but they still have a big stick held over their heads by the United States and the UK. So not clear quite how Turkey's going to react to this.
Well, that's true, Mike. Turkey obviously played its Western hand to ultimately try and join the European Union. Then they got caught out with the coup. Then I think the Russians said to them, you need to decide which side you're on. And ultimately, of course, Turkey's decided that it's probably with the Russian side. So I think they are going to stay on that side now. And I also think that Turkey's worked out, of course, that it was the Americans helping to unleash a coup in order to get further control over Turkey.
So plenty of propaganda to be found this morning on this issue, but possibly none quite as egregious as this. This is AFP pushing out this image. And what are they saying about it there? A displaced Syrian girl who was wounded by shelling in Idlib. And well, the thought that came to my mind here, Brian, was who did her hair? Did they get Nicky Clark or John Frieda in to do it? Perhaps they resurrected Vidal Sassoon himself to do it, because this is Hollywood standard makeup and hairdo here.
And ultimately, it's abuse of this child, because we've got children who are being deliberately used as part of a propaganda campaign, essentially by the West. But this little girl, whatever you say about her, wherever she's come from, she's hurt her thumb, she is being abused by being used for this sort of propaganda.
I know we can only see one eye there because this is quite a common feature amongst celebrities. David, let's bring you into the programme and say welcome. What are your thoughts on all this?
Well, the position of Turkey, for a start, is very interesting because they have their own agenda. They have an agenda against the Kurds. They have an agenda for a greater Turkey, perhaps, and certainly against any sort of Kurdish state. So they are very much working to their own set of advantages, and they're looking, I think, to regain their commanding position in the world of Islam, as they had at one point during the Caliphate. So you're going to see, I think, a much more muscular and independent Turkey, and they will take some advice and assistance from the Russians, and they'll take some, well, what are we getting from the Americans these days? Not an awful lot. Interference and dodgy dollars. I don't know how much longer that one's got to run, but they'll continue to pay lip service to the American and Western interests as long as it suits them. And then meanwhile, we've got strange predictions coming from America about forthcoming Assad-generated chemical weapons attacks that apparently can be seen by the United States ambassador to the UN in her crystal ball, we would assume.
Well, or some kind of witchcraft there anyway. But let's move on then, because of course Novichok 2, the sequel, has been continuing this week. And just want to remind everybody of what Theresa May said back in July at the G7 meeting. Here she was. She said, and today G7 leaders have agreed to establish a new rapid response mechanism. So the question was, what was this rapid response mechanism? Well, the key points were that it was to be a coordinated attribution of hostile activity, and it was tojoint work to assert a common narrative and response. So it's perhaps not surprising that today there has been a release from the leaders of France, Germany, the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. They have reiterated their outrage at the use of chemical nerve agent known as Novichok in Salisbury on the 4th of March. We welcome, they say, the progress made in the investigation into the poisoning of the Skripals and take note of the attempted murder charges brought yesterday against 2 suspects that are on screen there. We commend the work of the UK police and all those involved in this investigation. We also note the UK's analysis, independently verified by the OPCW, that the exact same chemical nerve agent was used in the poisoning of Don Sturgis and Charlie Rowley, as was used in the poisoning of the Skripals. We urge Russia to provide full disclosure of its Novichok program to the OPCW, and we encourage those with information about the attack in Salisbury on the 4th of March, as well as the further poisoning in Amesbury, to come forward to UK authorities. We have full confidence in the British assessment that the 2 suspects were officers from the Russian Military Intelligence Service, also known as the GRU, and that this operation was almost certainly approved at a senior government level. We've already taken action together to disrupt the activities of the GRU through the largest ever collective expulsion of undeclared intelligence officers. Yesterday's announcement further strengthens our intent to continue to disrupt together the hostile activities of foreign intelligence networks on our territories, uphold the prohibition of chemical weapons, protect our citizens, and defend ourselves from all forms of malign state activity directed against us and our societies. So that is the first real outcome of the rapid response mechanism, with 5 or 6 countries there signing something which has clearly been written by the British government.
Been written by the British government, but what comes into my mind there when you were showing that G7 thing and those 2 aims, this is the common purpose.
Yeah.
This is absolutely the common purpose now coming in across the European Union. But interestingly, they say almost certainly run by senior government level. So we've got the almost certainly still in there when they're pointing a finger at the Russians. The Russians did it. It was run from Putin's office, almost certainly. So we still don't have any evidence. The other key word, I think, there is disrupt. We can show that there is a disruptive program which is being carried out inside the UK in order to bring in the change agenda. The government is using disruptors. And I think when they're talking about disrupting things with the Russians, this is really coded message to say our agenda is going to be unleashed on the Russians. That's my personal opinion.
Well, David, you mentioned Nikki Haley and what's been going on at the UN. Trump definitely doesn't necessarily have friends around him, and the New York Times here publishing an anonymous opinion piece headlined, "I'm part of the resistance inside the Trump administration." So we seem to be getting a picture here of an administration which is really has the knives out for the man.
Yes, this piece here, written by someone within the Trump White House,
allegedly,
allegedly, and published in the New York Times op-ed page. It goes on. It says the dilemma, which Trump does not fully grasp, is that many senior officials in his own administration are working diligently from within to frustrate parts of his agenda and his worst inclinations. I should know I am one of them. And he goes on, he says, it may be cold comfort in this chaotic era, but Americans should know that there are adults in the room. Look how they talk about the leader. There are adults in the room. We fully recognize what is happening, and we're here trying to do what's right, even when Donald Trump won't. The result, their words, the result is a two-track presidency. And he says, this isn't the work of the so-called deep state, it's the work of the steady state. A very interesting piece. They're talking about the deep state here, claiming not to be it, but then, well, okay, maybe they are, maybe they're not. When we look at the Trump presidency, we do see a two-track. We see quite a lot of anti-war, despite all the military build-up. We see quite a lot of generating peaceful interactions with people. And then we see things like the missile attack on Syria that makes no sense. So this is perhaps revealing what's really going on here, that there's war and there's subversion within the Trump White House. Now, the New York Times came back and did a further piece on this, talking about Trump's angry reaction to it. And in that, they said, some loyalists to Mr. Trump said this amounted to an unconstitutional seizure of power by unelected staff members. Well, that's true, isn't it?
Indeed, but it goes further because, well, Paul Craig Roberts here on his blog, his headline is Washington's belligerence can produce a world holocaust. Now, he was sort of echoing comments made by Willy Wimmer, who, of course, German politician, writing in German RT and also, I think, in, well, one of the other German publications. And he was warning of a situation after the midterm elections in the United States where Trump's opponents could win enough of the runoffs to actually remove him from office. And Wimmer's saying that this could be a prelude to war against Russia, potentially nuclear war. He said the hate potential of Anglo-Saxon global media means that this is not going to be the normal or even escalated confrontation, but rather that is the road to the annihilation of the assumed enemy of the United States war coalition. This gives you an idea of the power of the deep state. And then Paul Craig Roberts here saying Donald Trump was the only candidate for president who emphasized the necessity of normalizing relations with the other major nuclear power. The military security complex saw this commitment as a threat to their massive budget and power and orchestrated Russiagate in order to prevent President Trump from normalizing relations with Russia. The CIA-led attack on President Trump has had the full support of the Democrats and the liberal progressive left, who are agitating for the impeachment of Donald Trump, thereby removing the only politician with enough wits to see the danger in the extremely high tensions between Washington and Russia. If the propaganda campaign against Trump succeeds, whoever follows him in office will have to show hostility towards Russia or suffer the same fate. Therefore, it's a reasonable conclusion that at this present time, the only persons who stand between us and nuclear Armageddon are Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. So that's pretty strong words from both sides of the Atlantic. And of course, what you've just described from the New York Times feeds into that.
It is, and we see it all over. We see it. I was looking at a tweet from the Glasgow Herald. David Leask, the slimeball journalist, well known to anyone who's followed the Holly Gregg case. Well, he was tweeting out warnings today, where people in the Scottish political scene are looking at the Novichok Putin did it narrative and not buying it. Well, he's calling these people as out for their Putinist conspiracy theories. Conspiracy spelt with two R's in a fine journalistic tradition. This is what you're seeing. So it's getting right down to sort of, you know, regional papers and national papers in Scotland. We're quite along, you know, we're not necessarily at the kind of forefront of this, but the press is being fed a line, and the obedient parts of the press are simply repeating that line. And the line is hate Russia.
Absolutely. Well, look, let's come back to the UK and to education. And of course, you've got to question the education of people that are buying the mainstream narrative at the moment. But anyway, this lady was on BBC Radio 4 Today programme this morning. This is Amanda Spielman. She's the Chief Inspector for Ofsted, which is, for our foreign viewers and listeners, is the regulator for education in this country. And she said, we haven't seen anything yet from the school inspections that she runs that says that schools are being unable to provide a good quality of education by reason of funding. Well, that's a very interesting statement. Now, of course, schools and the education systems having their budgets cut, but not only the baseline budget, but also where the money is going to, which we'll talk to David about in a second. But I just wanted to remind everybody of the headlines that were coming out a week or two ago. Here's iNews, and their headline was A-level students can still attain an A grade with almost half the wrong answers. And the point that we were making was that the pupils needed to score a little more than 50% in several cases over several subjects in order to score an A grade at A-level. This is the qualification in the UK that universities look to see whether you've achieved a particular standard for getting onto a university course. And this article says, but this was the key bit for me, David, the lower grade boundaries are an example of what they're calling comparative outcomes, the process of lowering grade boundaries in order to ensure that pupils aren't punished for taking on new, tougher examinations. So basically what's happened is that in the UK at exams at 16, at exams at 18 years old, they have been suffering from criticism that these exams are being dumbed down over the last 20, 30, 40 years. So what they've done this year is that they have brought in what they're describing as new tougher exams. But because the exams are tougher and the Liberals are saying that that means that pupils are being punished for having tougher exams, then they have to lower the grades in order to compensate for that. That's a pretty spectacular state of affairs, isn't it?
Well, when you have a pass rate in physics of 26%, right, that suggests that people are being awarded qualifications when they haven't demonstrated any mastery. And as people who employ the output from our education system know to their cost, this is true. Right? It doesn't matter what your qualification is. It doesn't matter if you have a master's degree. It does not mean that you can write. It does not mean that you can think. It does not mean that you're competent even in the core subjects that your degree relates to. And it's getting worse and worse. So there will come a point where the entire system will be worthless in education terms, but then it's not really about education. It's about something else.
Can I just add in there? Well, what comes into my mind immediately is Conservative MP Nick Bowles, because what he said is the Conservatives plan to produce a period of constructive destruction in public services. And I think this is the policy that we're seeing. Many people look at it and say it's ridiculous. They don't know what they're doing. They absolutely know what they're doing. They're destroying the system, which would produce well-educated, well-balanced young people to take the country on into a happy and prosperous future. This is applied cultural Marxism, surely.
Yeah, I mean, yes, that's correct. There is certainly a decision to destroy the system, but where that's coming from, the impetus behind that has been the failure of the system. Right, so the system that was brought in was brought in from Prussia. The education system is Prussian, and it's come in, and it was all about control. It's about a compliant workforce, and it's about a workforce that will make good soldiers and good factory workers, and we don't want too many ideas. Now, this doesn't work, and the longer this goes on, the more that we're not getting the qualities we need, even in that regard. So they're recognizing that the system is broken, the system is failing, and then they said, well, we want to radically remake it, so we must have this creative destruction, etc. And the problems they're pointing to justify this are real problems. But of course, what they're doing is essentially more of the same. They're not coming up with real solutions because they've not been honest about where the problems came from.
Right, well, look, David, let's have a look at what's going on in Scotland, just quickly, if we could, because we need to move on through this. We've got the Times, first of all, £60 million for mental health counselling in all Scottish schools.
Yes, every Scottish secondary school will have mental health counselling. This is very interesting. 350 counsellors, 250 specialist trained nurses will be employed to tackle growing levels of anxiety and depression, which many blame the increasing use of mobile devices and social media for. Now, this question that the Times hasn't asked here, the question that the Parliament hasn't asked, what's the nature of the counselling? Is it confidential? Because this is key. Because yes, there are problems with mental health in schools, and there are most certainly problems with young people having very serious mental health problems. But the solution for that is a service that they can go to when the young person chooses and speak to someone confidentially. Now, I suspect this government scheme will not be confidential. It'll be part of a huge data mining operation as your well-being is plotted on a database and you and your entire family are monitored by the state. Now, that is not the solution.
Indeed. And in the meantime, we've now got a national campaign running in Scotland urging parents to withdraw children from the primary one test. Now, primary one, that's what age is that? 4 to 5, or is that 5 to 6?
It's round about 5. I mean, you can start a little before 5, or you can start when you're 5 and then move on to 6. Depends just how the school year hits. So around about 5 years old, and parents are rightly not happy about this. And neither, by the way, are children's charities, neither is the Educational Institute for Scotland, the Teachers Union. No one seems to be happy about it, but the government's determined to push ahead anyway, because, well, we can't do anything about these things, but we can measure children, we can have more standardization, we can have more statistics, we can handle that. So this has gone on for a while. Then there was a letter that came out, the next couple I'll just quickly go through. A letter came out describing these tests as not compulsory. And then that was clarified. This is a wonderful piece of government clarification. The assessments, in common with all other aspects of Scottish curriculum and its delivery, are not provided for in legislation. This means that they cannot be seen as compulsory. But it also means that there is no legal right for parents to withdraw their children from the assessments, or indeed any other part of the school curriculum, with the exception of some parts of religious observance and instruction. So it's not compulsory, but you have no choice. This is the cry from our government over and over. You're free, but you have no choice. Yes.
Yes, good stuff. Okay, well, look, let's move on to Matthew Hancock, the Department of Health AI bot. Now, this is what he was saying a couple of days ago. If you remember, he said, "We love the NHS and are determined to guarantee it for everyone in the long term." So that was a couple of days ago. Today, he has a new little mantra. He says, "I love the NHS." So Matthew Hancock loves the NHS now. It's been there for me, and it's been there for all of us at some of the most difficult moments of my life. The NHS has saved the lives of my close family and has cared for family and friends in dire need. So what's he talking about here? Well, the NHS is going to become the most advanced health service in the world, Brian, by embracing the best innovations in new technology and artificial intelligence, according to Matthew Hancock. Now, Matt Hancock, of course, the former digital minister, and then he became Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, where he promoted AI and all kinds of new technology and robotics and all this kind of stuff. Now he is the Department of Health AI bot, so he's going to be moving AI into the Department of Health. So he's setting out plans at the NHS Expo in Manchester today to make the NHS an ecosystem for the best technology available. And this is going to build, they say, on the £20 billion long-term plan to transform health and social care so it can improve treatment and deliver better care for patients. I'm sure we all believe that that's going to be the outcome. So what's he doing? Well, of course, he launched his own app, if you remember, not so long ago, on iPhone and Android, and you can learn all about Matt Hancock through the Matt Hancock app. So he's going to do the same now for the NHS. So he has announced a new NHS app that's going to be piloted in 5 areas of England from next month, ahead of a national rollout in December. So Liverpool, Hastings, Bristol, Staffordshire and South Worcestershire are the lucky locations that are going to get access to the new NHS app. And they're going to be able to book GP appointments, order repeat prescriptions, get access to their medical record. I'm sure there's going to be all kinds of really special security around that. But anyway, that's another issue. They're going to have access for urgent medical inquiries. They're going to have data sharing preferences settings in there, so you're able to decide where your data is going. There's going to be organ donation preferences settings in there, and end of life care preferences in there. So you hit the wrong button on this app and you find that you've got a do not resuscitate on your record straight away. So there you go. This is fantastic stuff. Now, he's also going to announce the creation of the Health Tech Advisory Board, which is going to be chaired by Dr. Ben Goldacre. There he is, Dr. Ben Goldacre. And that's going to report directly to Matt Hancock, and it's going to highlight where change needs to happen, where best practice isn't being followed, and it will be an ideas hub for how to improve patient outcomes and experience and make the lives of NHS staff easier. Now, who is Ben Goldacre? Well, he's a doctor, but he's also done a lot of writing. So he used to have a column on The Guardian called Bad Science, and he's very pro-vax. So he was using that column, for example, to criticise anti-immunisation campaigners, particularly people that were promoting Andrew Wakefield, such as Melanie Phillips. And then following that, but this is where it starts to get interesting, he wrote a second book called Bad Pharma, How Drug Companies Mislead Doctors and Harm Patients. And you can see a quote from that there. Drugs are tested by the people who manufacture them in poorly designed trials on hopelessly small numbers of weird, unrepresentative patients, and analysed using techniques that are flawed by design in such a way that they exaggerate the benefits of the treatment. So not quite clear exactly where he sits, but then we begin to discover a little bit more, because he wrote a policy paper for the Cabinet Office in collaboration with the Behavioural Insights team. So I'm just not clear where this guy stands or what he represents. But anyway, he is now in charge of the new Health Tech Advisory Board, which Matthew Hancock is launching today. So this is fantastic stuff.
Perhaps we just reinforce there, Mike, that the statement that he's made there about the fact that drug trials are completely unrepresentative and carried out by the companies is absolutely true.
Absolutely.
But on the other hand, he's supporting vaccines, if I've heard your report correctly. So this man appears to have a split personality, but he's working with the Behavioural Insights team. And we have been warning. What is this about? It's the government using applied behavioural psychology, including neurolinguistics, in order to convince the public that the government's policy is correct and we can't think for ourselves. David, I'm just going to say 30 seconds. These people are unbelievably dangerous.
Unbelievably confused. Like, how can you write a book that's pro-vaccine, following up with a book that says that the drug companies can't be trusted and that the safety regimes are not worth the paper they're written on? Right? Surely you have to then repudiate the first book. Surely you have to say why I was wrong about vaccines. I mean, it's just a matter of consistency.
Only if you've got a conscience of some form.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's the problem.
Yeah, well, indeed. Absolutely. Speaking of people with no conscience, well, it's great stuff. Tony Blair is back, apparently. He's coming back into mainstream politics. Another appearance on the BBC Radio 4 Today programme. They have him on now every 3-4 weeks, it seems. They seem to love him. And so he was back on the programme today, and he is coming back into politics because he's really concerned about what's happening to the Labour Party. But he says he doesn't think the British people will tolerate a situation where, for example, the choice at the next election is Boris Johnson versus Jeremy Corbyn. So he's talking about a new centrist party as an alternative to the Labour Party. And I'm thinking to myself, are you really saying that? I mean, this is kind of rhetorical because we know that he has no conscience and so on. But, you know, does he really think that the British people would tolerate a situation where, for example, a new centrist party was to appear with him at its head? I don't think so.
We hope not.
Well, indeed.
We hope not. Behind the scenes, though, we've got some very dangerous stuff going on, and sometimes researching for UK column news leads you down very interesting paths. Quite a few people had sent me emails pointing out the BBC's sudden dramatic interest in female genital mutilation. So this has now become one of the BBC's hot topics. I went to have a look at that subject. I went to look at a lady journalist talking about that subject, and it led me down a completely different path. So let's have a look at what I found. Well, this is the story. This is going back to the 17th of August when Newsnight put out a programme on the rise of the extreme right wing in Britain. And the lady journalist that I'd first had a look at had actually embedded a summary video of this on her Twitter page. So I'm just going to let that run on screen. There's no sound, but basically we've got a former head of counter-terrorism for the Met saying that we've got white supremacists on the rise, that first time since the Second World War. We haven't woken up enough. He's not going to say it's the same level as Islamic terrorists, because out of 14 plots, 10 were Islamic. But the whole thrust of the programme is as if the right-wing extremism is as bad. So there's no pretense it's there's no pretense that it's the same, but actually the whole thrust of the programme is as if it is immensely dangerous. So I'm going to encourage people to go and have a look at it themselves, but we did a bit of analysis on it. Let's have a look at what we've got. Right-wing extremism is very, very dangerous, and it's growing. It's not as dangerous as Islamic extremism, although we're showing it as if it were.
We being the BBC.
We being the BBC. Now, this was interesting. We see right-wing extremists copying Islamic ideas by, for example, white jihad. So the Islamic terrorists and extremists, of course, always talking about a jihad religious edict, usually to have people killed or to start wars. But it's now very worrying that right-wing extremists are saying, well, if they're doing it, I don't see why we can't do it. And we're talking about a white jihad. So lots of questions about that little statement in the video clip. We see right-wing groups trying to use problems such as food banks to become more accepted and mainstream. So this suggests from the outset that all of the right-wing groups are so cynical that they're prepared to use the fact that people haven't got enough food to further their political aim. The BBC doesn't come in to say, well, could it be that some of these right-wing extremists have arisen because of these problems? I'm throwing these questions in because the BBC doesn't want to put them in. We see both groups pushing the message that communities cannot get along. So they're saying that we've got right-wing extremist groups and the Islamic groups both essentially putting the same message that communities can't get along. And the BBC doesn't ask a single question about what's really creating this right-wing movement. Is that former police head of counter-terrorism correct in saying that this is the first time we've had a real right-wing movement since the Second World War? Combat 18 comes into my mind, but maybe I'm wrong on that. So who put this picture together, or this little documentary together? Well, it's Richard Watson from the BBC, and his experience, or claimed experience, is that he's been a terrorist expert for 18 years with a focus on the Islamic terror group Al-Muhajirun, sorry if I've got that correct, and he started his research after 9/11. Now, when we had a look at this man, it became very interesting indeed, because he produced quite a long article about this terrorist group. And here's the questions he's asking. Has it been underestimated? Now, this is exactly the same line he's taking with the right-wing extremism. Have we underestimated the right-wing extremism? Well, it's fascinating because he says that after the Manchester Arena bomb attacks last month in this report, MI5 let it be known that the scale of the threat from militant Islamists is huge. 3,000 people in the UK with links to another 20,000. That makes a long list of 23,000 people, the population of a small town. So that's quite a statement. Then he says the fact that Al-Muhajirun was allowed to recruit in towns across the UK for years, largely unfettered by the state, is part of the picture. So now we're beginning to see that actually the highest level of the British state was allowing this to grow.
Encouraging, in fact.
Encouraging it to grow, unfettered, But he fails to investigate why this would be. He does not ask the key questions as to why senior members of the British government were not doing their job and or were turning a blind eye. He did ask some questions, which we'll have a look at in a minute. But this is the head of the organisation, Omar Bakiri Mohammed, the creator of Al-Muhajirun. And what's said in this article here, well, really, we need to see that basically the group was set up. He was born in Syria, but he was expelled in 1977 for his anti-Ba'ath Party views. He travelled to Lebanon, where he joined the Islamic group Tahrir. Their aim was to create a single Islamic state across the Middle East and eventually the world. So that was pretty specific. After a brief stay in Egypt, he settled in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. In 1983, he created a new group, and that was Al-Muhajirun. The name means the community of the emigrants. In 1986, his extreme Islamist views and connections in the banned Al-Tahrir group led the Saudis to expel him, and he fled to the UK, where he was given asylum. So once again, we've got a track record here where people who were known to be immensely dangerous were simply let into the UK. And who let them in? Well, it was our own government, of both sides of the colour, as it were. So if we have a look at it, he doesn't give any analysis of why the militant far right has emerged, what their grievances are. For example, one of the big grievances is the rise of Islamic extremism. He doesn't give any interviews with these people, although he did go and interview Islamic extremists. He hasn't given any real analysis of why Islamic terrorism has increased after Western actions in the Middle East. So when these people point the finger and say, we're doing what we're doing because the West has killed and murdered people in wars overseas, he doesn't really investigate that. And he's got no questions as to why the right wing says that the political establishment is not answering the concerns of members of the public. So it's very one-sided stuff. And I found it particularly significant that he also uses somebody speaking for Hope Not Hate to give a view. This is a right-wing extremist come good. But of course, Hope Not Hate, very one-sided in putting across its views. So if we have a look at how the state has reacted, and he does cover this, we've got a Peter Clark, former head of Met Counterterrorism, saying no one knew whether the ideological stance of Muhajirun was going inevitably to lead to violence. That's a remarkable statement, Mike, I think. We just didn't know. Once the threat from dissident Republicans receded, the focus on the Islamic threat grew very quickly. It's also probably fair to say that no one had before encountered a terrorist threat that was rooted in ideology rather than political goals. Why is this a problem? I do not understand why this is a problem if you're looking at potential terrorists. And then we've got Colonel Richard Kemp. Now, he was working with the Cabinet Office from 2001 to 2006, and he calmly says we've been too tolerant to this organisation. Their use of abusive language and threats was not tackled. It was a major failure, and we've seen the consequences. We've seen Lee Rigby murdered by a follower of Al-Muhajirun. We've seen numerous attacks around the world. So the people who should have been implementing the policy to protect the country were clearly not doing their job, but they casually say, well, it wasn't my fault. And so let's bring in the meat with an eye on the clock. And of course, what doesn't he do at all? There is no challenge to the prime ministers who were actually responsible for opening the door and allowing the unfettered rise of Islamic terrorism. But the BBC is going to now have a documentary raising the fear factor about the rise of a far right. So I think this was dangerous whitewash by the BBC. And if you analyse it, it's likely to increase hate. We've already got politicians reacting to this. So if he was aware that terrorists have been given asylum, and unfettered ability to recruit extremists in UK. Why did he not challenge those prime ministers and senior politicians responsible? No questions asked by the BBC at all. And why isn't he investigating the concerns which is giving right to this far right? He doesn't want to go there either. And then I'm going to ask this question: by failing to ask these key questions, is it that the BBC is actually playing two sides against each other for the benefit of the corrupt British state that caused the problem in the first place? It's a bit of a rapid run through that, David, but it's just fascinating to see how the BBC is so utterly devious when it gets into these very, very serious policy areas. We let terrorists into the country. They didn't invade. Politicians opened the doors. The intelligence community turned a blind eye. And now we've got a problem. Everybody's rushing around saying, well, we really don't understand how this happened. Is this accidental?
Well, what was occurring to me as you were describing that is it's a case of trying to run problem reaction solution. Right? They've created the problem. They've imported the terrorists into the country. Right? There hasn't been the reaction from the British population that they expected, because despite the fact that there's lots of people running around calling the British population racist, they've actually been extremely reasonable and extremely patient and extremely calm about the whole thing. So we're going to have to create the reaction. Is that what's happening here? So we can roll out the solution?
So we can roll out the solution, and there is a reaction forming. And you picked up on this really amazing tweet about the far right.
Oh, this is wonderful. Yes. So this is Yasmin Alabi-Brown, who is a Labour member of the House of Lords, I think. So she retweeted this. She said, "Too busy accusing UK Labour of anti-Semitism to heed the real scary threat posed by the far right." Right? Because you obviously read the post which said Nazi gathering in the streets of Britain today. This is the 21st century. Where is the outrage? It's happening again. But didn't realize it was a wind-up, because that is in fact the reunion photograph of the cast of Allo Allo. And there's Herr Flick of the Gestapo looking very fine in his black outfit.
So we're seeing the reframing of people acting in such a powerful way. You mention the word, you press the button, and boof, they're off with a reaction. Yeah, we'll talk more about this, I think.
Okay, we're rapidly running out of time, David, but let's just briefly go through some Scottish news here. First of all, named person scheme, and J.K. Rowling, fresh from campaigning on Twitter on behalf of Bana of Aleppo and various so-called rebels in Syria, now has moved north of the border in order to help boost the named person scheme.
Well, she hasn't, because they never quite get round to asking her. But this was from minutes. This is from government minutes of the GIRFEC team. From August 2018, they proposed to recruit J.K. Rowling, as I'm quoting here from a Scottish Review article by Alison Price. Recruit J.K. Rowling as the magic wand waving champion for the flagging Getting It Right for Every Child GIRFEC policy, in order to, quote, countermine the likes of Alexander McCall Smith and other unnamed Z-listers. Now, this is a caustic reference to the fact that Alexander McCall Smith, in one of his books, one of his detective stories, had a reference to a named person, and the characters were viewing it as an insult to parents. As indeed it is. So yes, that's they were wanting to countermine him. Interesting phrase, don't you think? Countermining. So they're viewing this as a military operation to shut down and defeat opposition to the named person scheme. Well, it's going badly because we have freedom of information. We have some people squirreling away and finding out everything that the government is wanting to keep concealed. And it just gets better and better, and indeed funnier and funnier. And if you're laughing, you're winning.
Well, indeed. But in the meantime, something else to laugh about here seems to be is the Scottish National Party at war with itself? Certainly, Nippy, Nicola Sturgeon, doesn't seem to like Alex Salmond terribly much at the moment.
It's a very strange thing. Now, the background to this, very briefly, is that Alex Salmond was accused. Well, in fact, let's go back even further. The background to this is that in December 2017, Nicola Sturgeon and the woman she appointed as head of the Scottish Civil Service, Leslie Evans, changed the code of conduct and the disciplinary and complaints procedure to allow complaints about former First Ministers and former Ministers of the Scottish Government to be brought by Scottish Government employees after those people had left the government.
Sorry, so let me clarify this, David. So up until December 2017, nobody could have brought a complaint against Alex Salmond or any other government minister that had served in the past.
That seems to be the case, yeah, and not through this internal government complaints procedure. I mean, you can obviously make a complaint to the police, but that's got a different threshold. So the rules were changed in December 2017, and as if by magic, 1 month later, two women from the Scottish Government, two officials from the Scottish Government, made allegations of sexual misconduct amounting to assault against Alex Salmond. This was for alleged conduct back in 2013 when he was First Minister, and at least some of the incidents took place in the official residence Bute House. So this this investigation under the new rules ran for 3 months before Alex Salmond was informed in March. And then it ran on until July, by which point Leslie Evans was saying she was going to release it to the public. Alex Salmond was threatening to get an interdict to prevent the Scottish Government releasing this information to the public. And then it was leaked to the press. What I'm hearing in press circles is it was leaked by the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. But whatever the source, it was leaked to the press. They then started to run it. The Daily Record in Glasgow was running the story. And then Alex Salmond decided not to get an interdict because the story was already out. Instead, he decided to take the government to court for a judicial review of the entire process, saying the process had been unfair to him. He hadn't had a chance to understand the accusations being made against him. He hadn't had a chance to offer a proper defence. Now, I would have to say, from my experience of Leslie Evans and Nicola Sturgeon, I wouldn't be at all surprised that the process is entirely flawed. And I think it's quite wise of Alex Salmond to go down that route. And he's saying, which is maybe a little concerning, that if he loses in court, then he'll answer the charges against him in full. But if he wins in court, he'll be looking for Leslie Evans to answer for her missteps and errors in the whole process. So we'll see how that works out. He then ran a crowdfunder, got over £100,000 from well-wishers to take the Scottish Government to court, and then resigned from the SNP. So it's there is a shortage of popcorn in Scotland now from people watching this unfold on our screens.
Brilliant.
Okay, well, I think we better end there. David, thank you for taking us through that. It is extraordinary to watch politics in the UK unfolding. One thing's for sure, they're not getting any more compassionate for people and their problems. We're seeing this political elite arise. Tony Blair, who we've had on screen again today, of course, was saying quite a few years ago that in the future people wouldn't be elected in a democratic sense, they'd be appointed. And I think the Scottish Nationalist Party must be showing that system exactly how that system's going to work. Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you for joining us. We will be back at the same time on Monday. Bye-bye.